The blue and red lights bouncing off my garage door at 5:30 in the morning were not something I expected to see while sitting in the warm cab of my Kubota loader, watching the snow pile up exactly where I wanted it. I had been clearing my driveway and the driveways of 3 elderly neighbors since 4 in the morning, doing what any decent person would do after a February blizzard dumped 14 inches of snow across our Minnesota neighborhood. The temperature was hovering around -2 degrees, and I could see my breath even inside the heated cab as I climbed down to meet the 2 police officers approaching my property. "Morning, officers," I said, pulling my hat down over my ears. "Everything okay?" The older cop, whose nameplate read Officer Martinez, looked about as thrilled to be there as I was to have company. "We got a noise complaint. Also something about unauthorized snow removal equipment being operated in a residential zone." I stared at him, certain I had misheard. A noise complaint. At 5:30 in the morning after a blizzard, the younger officer, Thompson, was already looking around at my perfectly cleared driveway, then at Mrs. Henderson's house next door where her driveway was also cleared. "Sir, do you have permits for that equipment?" "Permits. It's a farm loader. I own it. I'm clearing snow from my property and helping my elderly neighbors who can't do it themselves." I gestured toward the 3 houses I had finished. "Mrs. Henderson is 82. Mr. and Mrs. Patterson are both in their 70s with bad backs. And the Kowalskis just had their 2nd baby last week. I was trying to help them out before anyone had to go anywhere." Martinez sighed and pulled out a small notebook. "Look, Mr. Carter Thompson," I said, "I've lived here for 6 years. Mr. Thompson, we have to respond to all calls. Someone reported you for violating HOA regulations about operating heavy machinery before 7 in the morning on weekdays. They also said you're creating a public disturbance." That's when I saw her. Brenda Anderson, the HOA president, standing in her doorway 3 houses down, wrapped in a pink bathrobe, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with what could only be described as satisfaction on her face. The street lights illuminated her perfectly, and I could see that smug expression even from 50 feet away. "You've got to be kidding me," I muttered. "Brenda called you because I was helping people." Thompson shifted uncomfortably. "We have to document the complaint, sir." "Do you have the HOA bylaws regarding equipment use?" At 5 in the morning. "No, I don't have them memorized, but I can tell you that helping people not get snowed in during a blizzard seems like it should take priority over some rule about noise." Martinez looked at the loader, then at the cleared driveways, then back at me. "How long have you been out here?" "Since 4. The snow stopped around 3, and I wanted to get everyone cleared before people had to leave for work." "And you were planning to do your own driveway and these neighbors' properties?" "Already did them. I was just moving the last pile away from the street when you showed up." The 2 officers exchanged glances. Martinez closed his notebook. "Mr. Thompson, I'm going to be straight with you. This is ridiculous. You're clearly helping people, but we have to file a report because a complaint was made. I'd recommend you check your HOA rules and maybe show up to the next meeting." "So I'm not being cited? For what? Being a good neighbor?" "No. But if the HOA wants to pursue this through their channels, that's between you and them." Martinez looked genuinely apologetic. "Stay warm and thanks for what you're doing for the neighborhood." As they walked back to their cruiser, I saw Brenda's door close quickly. The rage that had been building in my chest hadn't dissipated. I had lived in this neighborhood since 2019, and Brenda had been HOA president for the last 3 years. In that time, she had fined people for having grass that was half an inch too long, sent violation notices for Christmas decorations being up past January 1st, and even tried to ban people from parking their own trucks in their own driveways because they weren't aesthetically pleasing. But this was a new low, even for her. I finished moving the snow pile and parked the loader in my garage. The sun was starting to come up, painting the snow-covered street in shades of pink and orange. It would have been beautiful if I wasn't so angry. I went inside, made coffee, and waited for what I knew was coming. It arrived 3 days later, a certified letter from the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. I had to drive to the post office to pick it up because I had missed the delivery. The woman at the counter handed me the envelope with a sympathetic look that told me she probably knew what was inside. Sitting in my truck in the parking lot, I opened it. The letter was 2 pages long, printed on official HOA letterhead, and signed by Brenda Anderson herself. It detailed multiple violations: operating heavy machinery before approved hours, creating excessive noise, performing unauthorized modifications to common areas without HOA approval, and my personal favorite, creating a dangerous precedent that undermines the authority of the HOA board. The fine was $500, due within 30 days. There was also a notice that I was required to appear at a special HOA hearing in 2 weeks to address these serious violations and determine if further action is necessary. I read it twice, then a third time because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. They were actually going through with this. They were actually trying to fine me for clearing snow. That evening, I knocked on Mrs. Henderson's door. She answered quickly, her white hair perfectly styled as always, wearing a cardigan despite the heat blasting in her house. "Carter, come in, come in. It's freezing out there." "I can't stay long, Mrs. Henderson. I just wanted to ask you something." "Did anyone from the HOA contact you after I cleared your driveway last week?" Her expression changed immediately. "Oh, honey, yes. Brenda came by the next day. She told me I should have hired a professional service and that by letting you help me, I was contributing to violations of neighborhood standards." Mrs. Henderson's hands shook slightly as she spoke. "She said if it happened again, I could be fined too. She threatened to fine you." "Not in those exact words, but yes. I told her you were just being kind, but she didn't want to hear it. She went on about rules and regulations and how important it was that everyone followed the proper procedures." Mrs. Henderson looked up at me with worried eyes. "Carter, I don't want you getting in trouble because of me. The driveway would have been fine." "No, it wouldn't have. You can't shovel that yourself, and those services charge $200 minimum for a storm like that. I have the equipment and I wanted to help." I squeezed her shoulder gently. "Don't worry about me. I can handle Brenda." But as I walked back to my house in the dark, I wasn't so sure. The HOA had significant power in our neighborhood. They could place liens on properties, take people to court, and make life miserable for anyone who didn't fall in line. I had watched them force the Ramirez family to repaint their entire house because the shade of beige they had chosen wasn't on the approved color list. That had cost them thousands of dollars. I spent the next week researching. I read every single page of the HOA bylaws, which was about as exciting as it sounds. I looked up Minnesota state laws regarding HOAs. I found several interesting things. First, there was no specific rule prohibiting snow removal before 7 in the morning. The rule about heavy machinery had to do with construction equipment, and there was absolutely nothing about helping neighbors constituting a violation. More importantly, I found that the HOA had to follow proper procedures for hearings and violations, including providing specific evidence and allowing homeowners to defend themselves. They couldn't just arbitrarily fine people without due process. I also called a lawyer. His name was Mark Stevens, and he specialized in HOA disputes. His office was in Minneapolis, about 45 minutes from my house in the suburb of Maple Grove. "This is interesting," he said after I explained the situation. "Very interesting. And you're sure about the timeline?" "You started at 4 in the morning. Positive. I have the timestamp from my garage camera showing when I opened the door and took out the loader." "Perfect. Keep that footage. And you said they're claiming you violated a noise ordinance." "That's what the police said when they showed up, though they didn't cite me for anything." "Right, because there's no violation. Minnesota law allows for emergency snow removal at any time, and with a blizzard like that, it qualifies. The HOA can't override state law with their bylaws." Mark paused. "But here's the thing, Carter. Fighting this is going to cost money. Even if you're in the right, which you absolutely are, you'll have legal fees. Sometimes it's cheaper to just pay the fine and move on." "It's not about the money," I said. "It's about the principle. Brenda has been bullying people in this neighborhood for years. If I back down, she'll just keep doing it. Someone has to stand up to her." "All right then. Let's do this properly. I'll draft a response to their violation notice. We'll go to their hearing and present your case. If they still decide to fine you, we'll take it to court." The hearing was held on a Thursday evening at the community center, a small building at the entrance to our neighborhood that mostly sat empty except for monthly HOA meetings and the occasional resident event. I arrived 15 minutes early with Mark, carrying a folder full of documentation. Photos of the cleared driveways, the police report from that morning, statements from the neighbors I had helped, weather records showing the severity of the storm, and a detailed breakdown of why the HOA's claims were baseless. The room was set up like a small courtroom, which seemed unnecessarily dramatic. There was a table at the front where Brenda sat with two other board members. Craig Morrison, the vice president, who ran a car dealership and always wore suits that were too tight, and Susan Fletcher, the secretary, who usually just agreed with whatever Brenda said. About 20 other residents were scattered around the chairs, including Mrs. Henderson, the Pattersons, and several others I recognized from the neighborhood. Brenda called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of a gavel, which was absolutely ridiculous because this wasn't an actual court, but nobody questioned it. She read through the violations again, her voice taking on an official tone that made everything sound much more serious than it was. "Mr. Thompson, you've been accused of multiple violations of Meadowbrook Estates bylaws and regulations. How do you plead?" Mark stood up immediately. "This isn't a criminal proceeding, Miss Anderson. Mr. Thompson isn't entering a plea. He's here to respond to allegations of bylaw violations." Brenda's jaw tightened. "And you are, Mark Stevens' attorney. I'm representing Mr. Thompson in this matter." A murmur went through the crowd. Craig leaned over and whispered something to Brenda. She straightened her papers and cleared her throat. "That seems excessive for a simple HOA matter, but very well. Mr. Thompson or Mr. Stevens, would you like to respond to these allegations?" "Yes," Mark said. "My client categorically denies any wrongdoing. In fact, what Mr. Thompson did was not only legal but commendable. He woke up early after a severe snowstorm to help elderly and vulnerable neighbors who couldn't clear their own driveways. He used his own equipment on his own time, at no cost to anyone." "He violated the noise ordinance," Brenda interrupted. "Section 12. Subsection 4 of our bylaws clearly states that no loud machinery can be operated before 7 in the morning on weekdays." Section 12. Subsection 4 refers to construction equipment and renovations, Mark countered. "Snow removal during and immediately after a storm is exempt, as it falls under emergency maintenance. Furthermore, Minnesota State Statute 515B.3102 explicitly allows for emergency property maintenance that supersedes HOA restrictions. Craig spoke up for the first time. But he wasn't just clearing his own property. He was clearing other people's driveways. That constitutes a business operation, which requires approval from the board. Mr. Thompson didn't charge anyone for his services. He helped neighbors as a courtesy. There was no business transaction. Mark opened his folder and pulled out several sheets of paper. I have statements here from all 3 families Mr. Thompson assisted. They all confirm he refused payment and acted purely out of kindness. Susan Fletcher finally chimed in, reading from her own notes. The complaint also states that Mr. Thompson created large snow piles that blocked sight lines at the end of driveways, creating a safety hazard. I couldn't stay quiet anymore. That's completely false. I specifically pushed all the snow to the sides and back of driveways, away from the street. I made sure not to block any sidewalks or mailboxes. The piles are exactly where professional services would have put them. Order, Brenda snapped, hitting her gavel again. You'll speak when spoken to, Mr. Thompson. With all due respect, Miss Anderson, my client has every right to defend himself, Mark said. This isn't a dictatorship. It's a homeowners association hearing, and proper procedure requires you to allow the accused to present their case. Brenda's face was turning red. We are following proper procedure. But Mr. Thompson needs to understand that rules exist for a reason. We can't have residents just doing whatever they want whenever they want, regardless of how the community feels about it. How does the community feel about it? I asked, looking around the room. Because I count at least 15 people here who aren't on the board. Why don't we ask them? That's not how this works, Craig said quickly, but Mrs. Henderson was already standing up. I'd like to say something, if I may. Brenda looked like she wanted to refuse, but with so many people watching, she couldn't. Go ahead, Mrs. Henderson, but please be brief. Carter Thompson is one of the kindest young men I've ever known. When my husband died 3 years ago, Carter was the first person at my door, offering to help with anything I needed. He mows my lawn in the summer, he shovels my walk in the winter, and he checks on me regularly to make sure I'm okay. Her voice was shaking but strong. That morning when he cleared my driveway, I was worried sick about how I was going to get to my doctor's appointment. I can't afford those expensive snow removal services on my fixed income, and I certainly can't do it myself. Carter saved me, and now you're trying to punish him for it. You should be ashamed. Several people applauded. Mr. Patterson stood up next. Same here. My wife and I are both dealing with health issues. We were dreading going out there with our shovels in the freezing cold. When I looked out the window at 6 in the morning and saw our driveway was already clear, I nearly cried. This HOA should be thanking Carter, not fining him. More applause. Brenda was hitting her gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order. Please, everyone. We understand that Mr. Thompson's intentions may have been good, but intentions don't negate rule violations. We have to maintain standards in this community. What standards? Someone called out from the back. It was James Kowalski, the new father. The standard of punishing people for being decent human beings. My wife just had a baby. We were overwhelmed. Carter cleared our driveway without us even asking. He's a hero, not a criminal. The room erupted in conversation. People were shouting their support for me, questioning the board, and demanding to know why they were wasting everyone's time with this hearing. Brenda looked like she was losing control of the situation, and Craig and Susan were whispering frantically to each other. Mark leaned over to me and whispered, "This is going better than I expected." Finally, Brenda stood up and raised her voice over the crowd. "Enough. We will take all of this under advisement and make our decision. This hearing is adjourned. We'll notify Mr. Thompson of our ruling within 10 business days. Actually, Mark said loudly, we'd like a ruling tonight. You've heard the evidence. You've heard from the community. There's no reason to drag this out. The board needs time to deliberate, Susan said, but she didn't sound convinced. Fine, Mark replied. Then we'll see you in court. Because if you proceed with this fine, we will absolutely be challenging it legally. And I can promise you it won't look good when a judge hears that you're punishing someone for helping elderly residents during a blizzard. Brenda's face was now completely red. She grabbed her papers and stood up. Meeting adjourned, she said again, and walked out of the room with Craig and Susan following close behind. The residents crowded around me as soon as they left, shaking my hand, patting my back, thanking me. Mrs. Henderson hugged me tightly, and I could feel her shaking. I was so nervous to speak up, she said, but I couldn't let them do that to you. You were perfect, I told her. Thank you. Mark was packing up his materials, looking satisfied. Well, that was something. I've been to a lot of HOA hearings, but I've never seen a community turn on the board quite like that. What happens now? I asked. We wait for their decision. If they're smart, they'll drop this. If they're stubborn, which they seem to be, they'll proceed with the fine and we'll take it to court. And what are our chances in court? Honestly, 95% in your favor, maybe higher. No judge is going to uphold a fine for snow removal. But it'll take time and money, even though we'll win. Over the next week, things in the neighborhood got tense. I started noticing small acts of rebellion. The Mitchells painted their mailbox a bright blue, which definitely wasn't on the approved color list. The Ramirez family put up a basketball hoop without getting board approval. Mrs. Henderson left her garbage cans visible from the street, another violation of HOA rules, though she claimed she simply forgot to bring them in. People were tired of Brenda's iron grip on the neighborhood, and my situation had become a rallying point. There was talk of recalling the board and holding new elections. Someone created a Facebook group called Meadowbrook Residents United that gained 50 members in 3 days. Brenda didn't contact me directly, but I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she was furious. She had apparently filed complaints against 6 different residents for various violations in the past week, trying to reassert her authority. But nobody was backing down. On day 9, I got a call from Mark. They've made their decision. They're upholding the fine and adding an additional $250 for defiance of board authority related to your conduct at the hearing. I let out a long breath. Okay, so we go to court. We go to court. I'll file the paperwork tomorrow. This will probably take about 3 months to get a hearing date. In the meantime, don't pay the fine. If you pay it, you're admitting guilt. Wouldn't dream of it. Good. And Carter, start documenting everything. If Brenda tries to retaliate in any way, I want evidence. Photos, videos, witnesses, everything. You think she'll try something? She's already tried something. But people like her don't stop. She sees you as a threat to her power now. Just be careful. He was right. 2 weeks later, I got another violation notice, this time for having my truck parked in my driveway instead of the garage. The bylaw stated that vehicles had to be garaged overnight unless there was no room, in which case they could be in the driveway for up to 48 hours. My truck had been in the driveway for one night because I had been rearranging things in my garage. I took photos showing the date and time, documenting that it hadn't been more than 24 hours. But the fine still came, $150. 3 days after that, another notice. My lawn had not been edged properly, leaving grass clippings on the sidewalk. Never mind that it was February and there was still snow on the ground. Apparently, Someone had found a photo from the previous summer and was using it to retroactively fine me. Mark told me not to worry. This is actually good for us. It shows a pattern of harassment. She's targeting you specifically, and that's going to look terrible in court. The court date was set for mid-May, which felt like an eternity away. In the meantime, the neighborhood drama continued to escalate. A petition was being circulated to remove Brenda from the board, and it already had over 40 signatures. The next regular HOA meeting was scheduled for March, and people were organizing to attend in force. I went back to my normal life as much as possible. I worked my job as a project manager for a construction company, which meant long days and plenty of stress. Coming home to HOA drama was the last thing I needed, but I wasn't going to back down. In late March, another snowstorm hit. This one wasn't as bad as the February blizzard, only about 6 inches, but it happened overnight on a Wednesday. I woke up at my usual time, 5:30, and looked out at the fresh snow. My loader was fueled and ready in the garage. I thought about the elderly neighbors who would struggle with their driveways. I thought about the Kowalskis and their baby. Then I thought about Brenda, probably watching from her window, waiting to see what I would do. I got dressed, went to my garage, and started up the loader. If she wanted to call the cops again, let her. I wasn't going to stop helping people just because she had some power trip going on. I cleared my driveway first, then Mrs. Henderson's, then the Pattersons. By the time I got to the Kowalskis, the sun was starting to come up. Nobody called the police. Nobody came out to yell at me. I finished all 4 driveways and was back in my house by 7, drinking coffee and feeling good about what I had done. The violation notice came that afternoon, hand-delivered to my door by Craig Morrison. He looked uncomfortable as he handed me the envelope. "Just doing my job," he muttered. "You know this is ridiculous, right?" I said. "Look, man, I don't make the rules. Brenda's the president. She wants this enforced." He shrugged. "Maybe just stop clearing other people's snow for a while. Until the court thing is settled. So, I should let my elderly neighbors struggle because Brenda Anderson has a problem with kindness. I'm just saying, you're making this harder on yourself." Craig walked back to his car, and I stood in my doorway holding yet another violation notice, this one for $500 for repeated violations after official warning. Mark added it to our case file. We now had documentation of 4 separate violations, all clearly retaliatory, all filed after I had challenged the original fine. The evidence was piling up in our favor. The regular March HOA meeting was memorable. Over 60 residents showed up, which was unprecedented. The community center was packed. People were standing along the walls because there weren't enough chairs. Brenda looked shocked when she walked in and saw the crowd, but she composed herself quickly and started the meeting. The petition to remove her from the board was officially presented by a resident named Tom Fisher, who had lived in the neighborhood for 15 years. He read out the list of grievances: excessive fines, abuse of power, targeting specific residents, and failure to act in the best interests of the community. Brenda tried to dismiss it, claiming the petition didn't follow proper procedures, but Tom had done his homework. He had consulted with a lawyer and knew exactly what was required. The petition met all the criteria, and according to the bylaws, a special election had to be held within 60 days. "This is absurd," Brenda said, her voice rising. "I have served this community faithfully for 3 years. I have maintained our property values and kept our neighborhood looking pristine. And now you want to remove me because I enforced rules that everyone agreed to when they bought their homes. You're not enforcing rules," Mrs. Henderson called out. "You're using rules to bully people." "There's a difference." The crowd erupted in agreement. Brenda tried to gavel the meeting back to order, but people weren't having it. One by one, residents stood up and shared their own stories of excessive fines, arbitrary enforcement, and HOA overreach. The picture that emerged was of a board that had lost sight of its purpose, more focused on control than community. Craig and Susan both looked like they wanted to be anywhere else. When someone asked if they supported Brenda's actions, Craig said nothing, and Susan gave a non-committal answer about following the rules. The meeting ended with the special election scheduled for April 20th. Nominations for the board positions would be accepted until April 5th. It was clear that Brenda's reign was coming to an end, but she wasn't going down without a fight. Over the next few weeks, Brenda went on a campaigning spree. She sent out a mass email to all residents, defending her record and attacking the small group of malcontents trying to undermine the HOA. She organized a coffee meeting for residents who supported her, which was apparently attended by only 4 people. She even went door to door, trying to convince people that she was the victim in all of this. Most people politely declined to engage. Some were less polite. I heard from Mrs. Henderson that Brenda had tried to get her to withdraw her support for me by offering to waive a previous fine for a minor landscaping violation. Mrs. Henderson had told her exactly where she could put that offer. 3 candidates emerged to challenge Brenda for the presidency. Tom Fisher, who had started the petition, Rachel Kim, a lawyer who had moved into the neighborhood 2 years ago, and David Martinez, a retired teacher who had been a vocal critic of the board's recent actions. I threw my support behind Rachel. She seemed the most level-headed and had the legal knowledge to make sure the HOA operated properly. She also promised to review all recent violations and fines, with the intention of reversing those that were unjustified. The election was held on a Saturday in the community center. The turnout was massive. Almost every household sent at least one representative to vote. The results weren't even close. Rachel won with 62% of the vote. Tom Fisher came in second with 25%. Brenda received only 13%. Craig Morrison lost his position as vice president to Tom Fisher. Susan Fletcher managed to keep her position as secretary, probably because nobody else wanted the job. 2 new board members were also elected, both of whom had been vocal about the need for reform. Brenda's face as the results were announced was something I would never forget. She looked shocked, angry, and somehow diminished all at once. She gathered her things and left without saying a word. A few people applauded as she walked out, which seemed harsh, but also understandable given how she had treated people. The new board held their first meeting the following week. One of their first actions was to review all violations issued in the past 6 months. They found that over 30 violations had been issued, which was 3 times the normal rate. Of those 30, 22 were deemed either unjustified or excessive. Mine were among them. Rachel called me personally to let me know. The board has voted to dismiss all violations against you and to issue a formal apology for the harassment you experienced. We're also going to reimburse you for any legal fees you've incurred. That's incredible, I said. Thank you. But what about the court case? It's scheduled for next week. I'd recommend you still go through with it. Even though we're dismissing the violations, Brenda issued them in her capacity as HOA president. Having a judge rule on this will set a precedent and ensure nothing like this happens again. Mark agreed when I called him. Absolutely go through with it. This is about more than just your specific case now. It's about establishing legal boundaries for what HOAs can and cannot do. The court date arrived on May 15th. It was held at the Hennepin County Courthouse in Minneapolis, in a small courtroom on the 3rd floor. Judge Patricia Reynolds was presiding, a woman in her 60s with gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. The HOA was represented by their insurance company's lawyer, a guy named David Fisher, who looked like he really didn't want to be there. This was technically a civil case, filed by me against the HOA for wrongful fines and harassment. The HOA could have settled at any time, but Brenda had apparently convinced the insurance company to fight it, even after she lost her board position. Mark and I sat at one table with our evidence folders. Fisher sat at the other with a much thinner folder. When Judge Reynolds asked him to present the HOA's case, he stood up and basically admitted defeat before even starting. Your Honor, the Meadowbrook Estates HOA acknowledges that the violations issued to Mr. Thompson were not properly justified under the bylaws. The new board has dismissed these violations and offered to reimburse Mr. Thompson for his legal expenses. We're here today to ask that this case be dismissed as moot, as there is no longer an active dispute. Judge Reynolds looked at me. Mr. Thompson, is that your understanding? That the HOA has backed down? I stood up. Yes, Your Honor, but with respect, I'd like to proceed with the case. The violations were issued by the previous board president as retaliation for me helping elderly neighbors during a snowstorm. Even though they've been dismissed, I want a legal ruling to prevent this kind of abuse of power from happening again. Mr. Stevens, anything to add? The judge asked Mark. Yes, Your Honor. This case is about more than just my client. It's about establishing clear precedent for HOA limitations. The previous board president abused her authority to target a resident for performing a good deed. That behavior needs to be officially condemned by the court to deter similar conduct in the future. Judge Reynolds nodded slowly. Mr. Fisher, does the HOA contest any of the facts as Mr. Thompson presented them? No, Your Honor. The facts are essentially accurate. Mr. Thompson did clear snow from his driveway and those of several neighbors early one morning after a significant snowstorm. The previous board did issue multiple violation notices as a result. The current board believes those violations were improperly issued. So we all agree on the facts. The only question is whether those violations constituted an abuse of HOA authority. Judge Reynolds opened a folder on her bench. I've reviewed the bylaws of Meadowbrook Estates, as well as Minnesota statutes regarding HOA powers and limitations. Mr. Stevens, walk me through your argument. Mark stood and presented our case methodically. He explained the timeline of events, starting with the snowstorm and my decision to help neighbors. He detailed the police response and their finding of no violation. He then went through each violation notice issued by the HOA, showing how they either misinterpreted their own bylaws or were issued in clear retaliation. Your Honor, the key issue here is Minnesota Statute 515B.3102, which allows for emergency property maintenance that supersedes HOA restrictions. A significant snowstorm qualifies as an emergency situation. Furthermore, Mr. Thompson was not running a business or violating any noise ordinances. He was simply being a good neighbor. And the HOA's response to this good deed was to fine him $500, then issue additional violations when he continued to help neighbors. Mark continued. This is a textbook case of HOA overreach and abuse of power. The previous board president, Brenda Anderson, used her position to harass and intimidate a resident who had done nothing wrong. Judge Reynolds turned to Fisher. Your response, Your Honor, the HOA does not contest Mr. Stevens' characterization of events. The current board agrees that the previous board's actions were inappropriate. We are here to take responsibility for those actions and make amends. That's all well and good, Judge Reynolds said, but it doesn't address the underlying issue. Mr. Thompson is asking this court to rule on whether the HOA had the authority to issue those violations in the first place. Do you have an argument on that point? Fisher looked uncomfortable. Your Honor, the HOA maintains that it has broad authority to enforce community standards as outlined in the bylaws. However, in this specific instance, we concede that the enforcement actions were not properly justified. So you're saying the HOA had the authority but chose to exercise it improperly? Yes, Your Honor. That's not much of a defense, Mr. Fisher. No, Your Honor, it's not. Judge Reynolds looked down at her notes for a long moment. The courtroom was silent except for the clicking of the court reporter's machine. Finally, she looked up. I'm going to make several rulings here. First, I find that the Meadowbrook Estates HOA did not have the authority to issue violations to Mr. Thompson for clearing snow from his own property or assisting neighbors during an emergency weather event. Minnesota law is clear that emergency property maintenance supersedes HOA restrictions, and common sense dictates that helping elderly neighbors constitutes a reasonable emergency response. She paused and looked directly at Fisher. Second, I find that the subsequent violations issued by the HOA constituted harassment and retaliation. The pattern of enforcement, the timing of the violations, and the clear targeting of Mr. Thompson after he challenged the initial fine all support this conclusion. Mark squeezed my arm gently. We were winning. Third, I am ordering the Meadowbrook Estates HOA to pay Mr. Thompson's legal fees in full, plus an additional $5,000 in compensatory damages for the harassment and stress caused by these improper enforcement actions. The HOA will also issue a written apology to Mr. Thompson and post a copy of this ruling in the community center where all residents can see it. My heart was pounding. $5,000 on top of the legal fees. I hadn't expected that. Finally, Judge Reynolds continued, I am going to say something for the record that I hope gets communicated to homeowners associations across this county and this state. HOAs serve an important function in maintaining community standards and property values. However, they are not autonomous governments with unlimited power. They are bound by state law, by their own bylaws, and by basic principles of fairness and common sense. She looked right at me now. Mr. Thompson woke up early on a freezing morning to help people who needed it. He used his own equipment, his own time, and his own fuel to make sure elderly residents could safely leave their homes. That is not a violation. That is the definition of being a good neighbor. Any HOA that punishes such behavior has lost sight of its purpose and needs to seriously reconsider its priorities. Judge Reynolds closed her folder. This court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Carter Thompson, on all counts. The HOA's violations are declared null and void, and the monetary damages are awarded as stated. Mr. Fisher, I trust the HOA will comply with this ruling promptly. Yes, Your Honor, the HOA will comply fully. Good. This case is closed. She banged her gavel and it was over. Mark and I walked out of the courtroom in a bit of a daze. In the hallway, he turned to me with a huge smile. That was incredible. Judge Reynolds didn't just rule in your favor, she absolutely destroyed the HOA's position. That speech at the end, that's going to get quoted in HOA cases for years. I can't believe she awarded damages, I said. I was just hoping to get the violations dismissed. She wanted to send a message. And trust me, every HOA in Minnesota is going to hear about this case. You just made it a lot harder for them to abuse their power. We walked out of the courthouse into a beautiful May afternoon. The sun was shining, and the temperature was finally above 60 degrees. Spring had arrived in Minnesota, which meant the long winter was truly over. It felt symbolic somehow, like I was walking out of the cold and into warmth. When I got home, Mrs. Henderson was waiting on my front step. She stood up as I pulled into the driveway, wringing her hands nervously. "How did it go?" "We won. The judge dismissed all the violations and awarded damages. It's over." She burst into tears and hugged me tightly. "Oh, Carter, I'm so glad. I've been so worried. You've been through so much because you helped me." It wasn't just about you, Mrs. Henderson. It was about all of us, about making sure people can be decent to each other without some petty tyrant punishing them for it. Over the next few days, word spread through the neighborhood. People stopped by my house to congratulate me. The Pattersons brought over a homemade pie. The Kowalskis invited me for dinner, where I got to hold their now 4-month-old baby. James told me they were thinking of naming their next kid Carter, which made me laugh and feel incredibly touched at the same time. The HOA posted the court ruling in the community center as ordered, along with a formal apology written by Rachel Kim and signed by all 5 board members. The apology was gracious and thorough, acknowledging the previous board's mistakes and promising to operate differently going forward. Rachel also implemented several reforms. She established a violation review committee made up of residents, not just board members, to ensure enforcement actions were fair and justified. She created a clear appeals process for anyone who received a violation. And she rewrote the bylaws to explicitly allow for emergency maintenance and good neighbor activities, so nobody would ever face what I had faced again. Brenda Anderson moved out of the neighborhood in June. I heard she bought a condo in downtown Minneapolis where there was no HOA and no neighbors to bother her. I didn't attend any goodbye gathering, and I don't think there was one. She left quietly, probably still bitter about how everything had turned out. Craig Morrison resigned from the car dealership and moved to Florida. I heard through the grapevine that he was tired of the Minnesota winters and the stress of the HOA drama. Susan Fletcher remained as secretary, and to her credit, she became much more independent and fair-minded under Rachel's leadership. In the fall, when the first snow of the season fell, I woke up early and took out my loader. I cleared my driveway, then Mrs. Henderson's, then the Pattersons, then the Kowalskis. I added 2 more houses to my route, the Fishers, who had an infant at home, and the Nguyen family, whose grandmother had just moved in with them and had mobility issues. Nobody called the cops. Nobody issued violations. When I came back home at 6:30 that morning, I found a thermos of hot chocolate on my doorstep with a note that said, "Thank you for being a great neighbor, from everyone on Maple Street." I stood in my driveway, drinking the hot chocolate as the sun came up, watching the neighborhood come to life. People were heading to work, kids were waiting for school buses, and life was going on normally, peacefully, the way it should be. The check from the HOA arrived the following week. Legal fees plus the $5,000 in damages, just as Judge Reynolds had ordered. I put most of it in savings, but I used some to buy a new snow blade attachment for my loader. If I was going to be the unofficial neighborhood snow removal service, I might as well have the best equipment. Winter deepened, and I continued my routine. Every significant snowfall, I was out early, clearing driveways and making sure everyone could get where they needed to go. Some people tried to pay me, but I always refused. This wasn't a business. It was just what neighbors did for each other. In December, the neighborhood held its first annual holiday party in years. The previous board had always talked about doing community events, but never actually organized any. Rachel and the new board made it happen. A potluck dinner at the community center with decorations, music, and genuine warmth. I brought my famous chili, which is really just a recipe I stole from my mom, but everyone seems to love it. Mrs. Henderson made her legendary sugar cookies. The Kowalskis brought their baby, who was now sitting up and grabbing at everything. It was loud and chaotic and absolutely perfect. At one point, Rachel stood up and made a short speech. "I just want to thank everyone for supporting the changes we've made this year. This neighborhood is what we make it. We can choose to be a community that supports each other, or we can be a collection of houses that happen to be near each other. I'm proud that we've chosen community." Everyone applauded. Someone started playing music and people actually danced. I found myself talking to neighbors I had barely known before, learning about their lives and their families. The sense of relief was palpable. We had taken our neighborhood back from someone who saw it as a fiefdom to control, and we had turned it into a real community. As I drove home that night, full of good food and good conversation, I thought about everything that had happened over the past year. It had started with such a simple act, clearing snow for people who needed help. That simple act had spiraled into police calls, violation notices, community upheaval, elections, and a court case. But in the end, it had been worth it. Not just because I won, though that felt good, but because it had sparked a change in our neighborhood. People had woken up to the reality that they had power, that they didn't have to accept being bullied by their own HOA. They had organized, they had voted, and they had created something better. The next spring, I planted a garden in my front yard. Under Brenda's rule, I never would have risked it because she would have found some bylaw violation in the way I arranged my tomatoes. But under Rachel's leadership, the board had loosened restrictions on front yard landscaping, as long as properties were maintained neatly. My tomatoes grew beautifully that summer, and I shared the harvest with my neighbors. Mrs. Henderson made tomato sauce. The Pattersons used them in salads. I taught the Kowalskis how to can them for the winter. That garden became another small connection point in the neighborhood, another way we looked out for each other. I kept all the documentation from the case in a folder in my home office. The violation notices, the court ruling, the apology from the HOA. Sometimes I would pull it out and read through it, reminding myself of what had happened. Not because I wanted to dwell on the negative, but because it was a reminder that standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, can make a real difference. The story spread beyond our neighborhood. Local news picked it up after the court ruling, and I did a couple of interviews about HOA overreach and community empowerment. The story went somewhat viral on social media, with people sharing their own HOA horror stories and discussing the need for reform. I heard from people across the country who were dealing with similar situations. HOAs that fine people for having the wrong color mailbox, that banned children's toys from being visible in yards, that tried to control every tiny aspect of how people lived in their own homes. Many of them asked for advice, and I always told them the same thing. Know your bylaws, know your state laws, document everything, and don't be afraid to stand up for yourself. Some took my advice and fought back. I heard success stories from California, Texas, Florida, and other states. People were winning cases against overbearing HOAs, getting bad board members removed, and reclaiming their communities. It felt good to know that my experience had helped others. But mostly, I just went back to my normal life. I worked, I maintained my house, I helped my neighbors when they needed it. The loader sat in my garage, ready for the next snowstorm. The garden grew and produced year after year. The neighborhood thrived under its new leadership. Years passed, and the story of the great HOA battle became a piece of neighborhood lore. New residents would move in and hear about it from the old-timers. "You live next to Carter Thompson. Oh, he's the one who took down the evil HOA president. Legendary. I would laugh it off when people brought it up. I didn't think of myself as some kind of hero. I had just been trying to help people and had refused to back down when I was punished for it. Anyone would have done the same thing, I always said, though I knew that wasn't quite true. A lot of people would have just paid the fine and moved on. Mrs. Henderson lived to be 92 years old. I continued to help her with snow removal, lawn care, and anything else she needed until the very end. When she passed away peacefully in her sleep, her children came to handle the estate. They made a point of thanking me for all the years of kindness I had shown their mother. She talked about you all the time, her daughter told me. She said you reminded her that there were still good people in the world. That meant everything to her, especially in her last years. The Pattersons eventually moved to Arizona for health reasons, but they stayed in touch. Every Christmas I got a card from them with a long letter detailing their new life in the warm weather. They always mentioned how much they missed the neighborhood and how grateful they were that I had helped make it such a special place. The Kowalskis had 2 more children, and all 3 kids grew up playing in the street on summer evenings, riding bikes and playing games the way kids should. James always credited the sense of community in the neighborhood for making it such a great place to raise his family. After you stood up to Brenda, everything changed, he told me once. People started actually talking to each other, helping each other. You showed us what a real neighborhood could be. I eventually did date someone, though that's a different story entirely. Her name was Beth Andrews, and she moved into a house at the other end of the neighborhood. We met at a community barbecue and hit it off immediately. She thought the whole HOA story was hilarious and impressive in equal measure. Most guys try to impress me with their cars or their jobs, she said. You took down a corrupt homeowners association. That's so much better. We got married 3 years later in the community center, the same place where I had fought the HOA hearing and where the neighborhood now gathered for regular events. It seemed fitting. The whole neighborhood attended, and Rachel Kim officiated since she had gotten ordained online specifically for the occasion. The HOA continued to function smoothly under Rachel's leadership, and then under subsequent boards that followed her model. There were still occasional disputes about violations, because that's the nature of any community organization, but they were handled fairly and reasonably. The culture had changed permanently. My loader finally died after 20 years of faithful service. I replaced it with a newer model, bigger and more efficient. I was still getting up early to clear snow for my neighbors, now including some second-generation residents who had grown up in houses I used to clear for their parents. Sometimes I would be out there at 5 in the morning, the loader's engine rumbling in the cold air, and I would think about that February morning when it all started. The police lights, Brenda standing in her doorway, the violation notices, the court case. It all seemed so long ago and yet still vivid in my memory. I never regretted any of it. Not the stress, not the legal fees, not the months of uncertainty and conflict, because the outcome had been worth it. I had helped people who needed help. I had stood up to someone who abused their power, and I had been part of transforming a neighborhood from a place of fear and control into a genuine community. And every time I cleared Mrs. Martinez's driveway, the woman who moved into Mrs. Henderson's old house, or helped the Tran family whose elderly father couldn't handle snow removal, or made sure the young couple with twins could get to work on time, I was reminded of why it had all mattered. Community isn't about rules and restrictions and making sure everyone conforms to someone's vision of perfection. Community is about people taking care of each other, especially when it's hard or inconvenient. It's about waking up early on a freezing morning because you know your neighbors need help. It's about standing up when something is wrong, even when it would be easier to stay quiet. The court ruling that Judge Reynolds issued became part of Minnesota case law, cited in dozens of subsequent HOA disputes. Legal experts wrote articles about it. It was taught in some law school classes as an example of proper judicial restraint of HOA overreach. The precedent it set made it harder for HOAs across the state to abuse their authority. But for me, the real victory was much simpler. It was the thank you waves I got from neighbors as I cleared their driveways. It was the thermos of hot chocolate left on my doorstep. It was the sense of safety and support that permeated the neighborhood. It was knowing that we had built something good together, something that would last. On the 10th anniversary of the court case, the neighborhood held a special celebration. Rachel, who was now a judge herself, gave a speech about the importance of community engagement and standing up for what's right. A plaque was installed in the community center commemorating the case and its role in transforming the neighborhood. I was embarrassed by all the attention but also deeply moved. These were my neighbors, my friends, my community. We had been through something difficult together and had come out stronger on the other side. That was worth celebrating. As I stood there that evening, surrounded by people I cared about, in a neighborhood that had become everything I had hoped it could be, I felt a deep sense of contentment. The Loader incident, as it had come to be known, had changed my life in ways I never could have anticipated. It had taught me about courage, community, and the importance of doing what's right even when it's difficult. And it all started because I wanted to help some neighbors clear their driveways after a snowstorm. Such a simple act, with such far-reaching consequences. It made me think about all the other simple acts of kindness that happen every day, mostly unremarked upon, but collectively creating the fabric of community and connection that makes life worth living. I looked around at the faces in the crowd, some old friends and some newer residents who had only heard stories about the great HOA battle. They were all part of this community now, all contributing in their own ways to making it a place where people looked out for each other. Beth squeezed my hand and smiled at me. "You did a good thing," she whispered. "You should be proud." I was proud, but not in a boastful way. I was proud of what we had all accomplished together. One person standing up had sparked a movement that had transformed an entire neighborhood. That was the real lesson. Individual action matters, but collective action changes everything. As the celebration wound down and people headed home, I walked out to my truck in the parking lot. The Loader was hitched to the back, ready for the next snowfall. The forecast said we might get a few inches over the weekend. I would be ready, as always, to make sure everyone could get where they needed to go. That's what neighbors do. That's what community means. And no HOA, no matter how powerful or controlling, could ever take that away. Brenda had tried and failed. The court had recognized the truth, and the neighborhood had thrived as a result. That was the ending to the story, though really it was just the beginning of everything that came after.